I moved to this country a year ago, and now everything has been like a quest to find myself. And but I was just talking to John about this as well. It has like burst my bubble, because a lot of times when I'm having conversations about decolonial thought or post-colonial thought, a lot of people just come at me with, it's an overly intellectualized way of thinking about things, or like you're overly theorizing something or anything like that. And I just find it so jarring, because it is basically everything that I am somehow, because I'm from India and I grew up with my family telling me stories about the independence movement and everything that led to it and happened after it. And I feel like everything that I know, everything and little that I know about freedom comes from there, and that is why I'm here. And thank you to Fezi and Shabir for that. So to begin, I will introduce John, who is a journalist, political activist and writer, and a co-founding member of Stop the War Coalition. He has written books including People's History of London with Lindsay German and Imperialism and Resistance. So,
thank you. I want to do two things tonight, really. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which the British have been responsible for the situation in Palestine historically, and I want to talk a bit about the movement that we're currently living through in solidarity with the Palestinians in the face of the onslaught on Gaza. Now, the so-called Israel-Palestine problem is quintessentially a British problem, a British creation, because it was the British Empire which controlled the historic area of Palestine after the First World War. The Ottoman Empire had allied itself with Germany. Germany, of course, lost that war, and the British inherited the League of Nations mandate over the area that now comprises the State of Israel, was historic Palestine. And during the First World War, a very important foundational statement of the modern State of Israel, the Balfour Declaration, issued by the British Home Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, promised territory in Palestine to the Zionist movement, to that movement which represented then a relatively small part of the Jewish population internationally, which was seeking to establish a geographical home for the Jewish people, to establish a theocratic Jewish state. And the Balfour Declaration was the green light from the British that they would advance and support that project. But in order to understand the exact imperial architecture of the Middle East, it's very important that we don't take simply the Balfour Declaration in isolation, because that was not the only promise that the British made in that area during this time. T. Lawrence of Arabia, and his commanding officers, seeking to get Arab support for their struggle against Germany, also promised to the Sheriff of Mecca the same land to the Arab people as a territory over which they would create modern nation states. So we have from the British not just one promise, but two promises, completely incompatible, and one of those promises to a group of people who didn't own the land, hadn't lived there, and were going to be as refugees, as migrants, predominantly from Europe in the 1930s and more still in the 1940s. And the importance of understanding that, there wasn't just one imperial promise, but two imperial promises to two groups of people which couldn't possibly both be acted upon, is very, very important, because that process is still the architecture of the Middle East today. You see, it's often said that Israel is a settler colonial state, that it's a state established because settlers came, took other people's lands, created a state on that basis. And that's true, insofar as it describes the relationship between the settlers and the indigenous population. Colonial settler state is an accurate description. But it isn't the complete story. That's the kind of view, if you like, of the internal structure of the Israeli state. But it's as important to say that it is also a garrison state in the Middle East. In fact, its purpose, the reason why, decade after decade, it enjoys such lavish support from the major powers, is because its purpose is not just to keep the Palestinians down, but to police the entire Middle East. In other words, its purpose, and obviously to keep all the Arab peoples down, it must keep the Palestinians down. But its wider purpose, Israel's wider function, is as a garrison state for imperialism in the Middle East, which guarantees Western corporations and Western states decisive sway over the fate of what has proved to be, ever since the discovery of oil and the construction of a global oil economy, one of the most important strategic places on the globe. And that architecture is partly sustained by the garrison state of Israel, but it is also partly maintained by support for the tyrannical, dictatorial kingdoms, princelates, dictatorships of the Arab world as well. So the biggest recipient of US military aid is Israel. The second biggest recipient of US military aid is Egypt, because Israel is paid to keep the Palestinians and the Arabs generally down, and the dictatorships are paid not to attack Israel. And you can see that to this day in British foreign policy, in exactly the same way as Balfour promised support to the Zionists, and T. Lawrence and his officers promised support to the Arabs. So the twin pillars of British imperial policy, and indeed since the British became a second-rank colonial power to the Americans, is this, that they support Israel, but they also support Saudi Arabia and Egypt, because the business of keeping the mass of people in the Middle East down is the business both of the Israelis and of the Arab dictatorships, and the business of protecting Israel is both arming Israel and paying the Arab dictatorships not to attack Israel. And you can see that taking place right now, because the Americans are exerting all the power that they can to stop other forces in the Middle East entering the war between Palestine and Israel on the side of the Palestinians. And that is the way in which the imperial structure of the Middle East works for the major imperial powers. And you see it all the time. Netanyahu is feted by the British government and by the American government, but so are the Saudi princes. The money goes to the Israelis, but it also goes critically to the dictatorship in Egypt. The same thing over and over again since the era of the Balfour Declaration: support the Israelis and support the Arab dictatorships so that the Arab masses don't pull apart the Israeli regime. And that is the basic structure of imperialism in the Middle East. That's the basic lineaments of imperialism in the Middle East. And of course, the level of support that the Americans, before them the British, now the Americans and the British and other Western powers give to Israel is above and beyond that given to any other power in the world. Not only does Israel receive the largest amount of American military aid, it also receives the largest single amount of American civilian aid. It is the only country in the world where American military finance can be used to purchase weapons from other countries, armaments manufacturers, and not just from America, as it is with anybody else who receives American military aid. American civilian aid can be used to purchase military hardware, but only if it is Israel. Israel can purchase directly from American arms corporations without a license from the American Defense Ministry, in a way that no other country in the world can. Now, you know, the British politicians often brag that they have a special relationship with the Americans, but the really special relationship is the relationship that the Israelis have with the Americans, because they have a set of relationships which are quite fundamentally different to any other country. If you run through now where the weapons of the Israeli Defense Forces come from, where the tanks come from, where the armoured cars come from, where the F-16s come from, you'll see it. Time this is publicly available information. All you've got to do is Google it. 88% from America, 89% from America, 86% from America. And that's what it means to be a garrison state. You are literally armed to the teeth in order to extend the influence, not just of the Israeli state, but of the entirety of the Western imperial architecture in the Middle East. And I think there's some consequences to this analysis. There's some important distinctions which this makes in terms of the kind of arguments that you currently find raging all over social media and inside the movements. Let me just point to one of them to underline the importance of clarity on the way in which imperialism has intervened in the Middle East. You will no doubt have seen come across, perhaps participated in discussions about the Zionist lobby, about the degree to which Israel is able to influence politicians and the media in the West because it has a very powerful PR machine, a lot of money to spend and so on doing precisely that. Now, that much is true. It certainly has a lobby. But in some accounts, it's almost as if there is a kind of conspiracy among Zionist lobbyists to undermine the stance of Western governments and get them to do things which they would otherwise not do in order to support the state of Israel. Now, if you think about the way in which I've described the relationship between the major imperial powers and the Israeli state, that isn't really a fully accurate. It is at best a partial description of events. Because lobbyists, lobbyists are often lobbying to get a government to do something it doesn't want to do. Climate lobbyists lobby governments to do something about the climate when they don't want to do it. But the Israeli lobby isn't that. Being an Israeli lobbyist is the easiest job in the world, because you're lobbying for them to do precisely what they would do anyway. If the Israel lobby didn't exist, it would still be in the interest of the major imperial powers to fund and arm Israel, and they would do it anyway. So being an Israeli lobbyist isn't trying to push at an open door even. That door is wide open and the red carpet is out and they walk down it, and they certainly assist in making Israel look as good as it's possible to make Israel look, which for many of us isn't very good at all, but that's their job. But what they aren't doing is the tail wagging the dog. And there have been occasions when the interests of the American state and the interests of the Israeli state have departed. For instance, on 2 occasions in the last 15 years, the Israeli state wanted to bomb the nuclear reactors in Iran. And the Americans said, you aren't doing it, and it didn't happen. Now, there aren't very many occasions where they separate like that, although now you are beginning to see some cracks. Now you are beginning to see some concern, not concern for Palestinians on the part of the Americans, let's not be ridiculous, but concern that the war may become so destabilizing that the entire region becomes destabilized. And the pressure, such as it is, that Blinken is trying to exercise on the Israelis, is a pressure not to pursue their goals so completely ruthlessly that it triggers other forces in the region into action and therefore destabilizes American interests across the Middle East. And this is a lot nearer happening than you get in most of the media reports. The operation which the Houthis are running out of Yemen is a much more effective military operation than you'll read in the Western press. On 2 occasions, at least that we know of, there have been cruise missiles fired at Israel that had to be brought down by the USS Carney in the Red Sea. They've now blocked, effectively, all tanker traffic to Israeli ports. In fact, there's one tanker stuck in the sea, which they're now running tourist boats out for people to view. The 2 battles with the USS Carney weren't just a few missiles and it was over. The first one took 9 hours and the second one took 8 hours. You will have seen now that the Israeli is stepping up its offensive on southern Lebanon. I spoke to Hani Lazim, who was one of the founder members of Stop the War, who was part of the Iraqi Democrats Against the War, who's been in Iraq for the past 6 months. He was on the demonstration on Saturday, and he said the level of attacks on American bases, not only in Iraq, but in Syria as well, is unprecedented in recent years. So there is a very real possibility that the war will become not an Israel-Palestine war, but a general conflagration in sections, at least, of the wider Middle East. And that is a point at which the Americans will be very unhappy if the Israelis can't be brought to heel. Now, if you have a watchdog, and that's what Israel is in the Middle East for the Americans, if you have a watchdog, sometimes it slips a leash. And the danger for the Americans now is that the Israeli watchdog will slip the leash. And if it slips the leash, it'll go around biting neighbours that it isn't supposed to bite. And that's exactly why Blinken is touring, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is touring the Middle East, trying to get that dynamic under control, not only with the Israelis, but by talking the Iranian regime down from taking any decisive action or licensing Hezbollah to take a greater part in the war than it has already. So, for all these reasons, for clarity of understanding, for being able to put aside some interpretations which, as I've tried to suggest, overstress the role of the Zionist lobby, it's important that we locate the key relationship as being that relationship between the imperial powers and the Israeli state and other actors other state actors in the Middle East. So I just want to spend a little bit of time. I've got 5 minutes here. I just want to spend a little bit of time about the movement, concluding on the movement, because every single national liberation movement that has been successful in the past, if we think about Algeria, or we think about Vietnam, or we think about South Africa, depends on a combination of factors. First of all, and obviously, it depends on the resistance of the people themselves, of South African blacks, or of Algerians, or of the Palestinians. It depends on their ability to resist. But it also depends on the ability of movements in the metropolitan imperial centres to weaken the resolve of the imperialist governments to be able to continue to support a colonial project in Vietnam or South Africa or in Palestine. Absolutely critical in many ways. The anti-Vietnam War movement, absolutely critical to weakening American resolve to continue. Of course, nothing without the resistance of the Vietnamese themselves, but given that resistance, critical that a second front is opened up against the imperial governments. And you can see now that the global movement in solidarity with the Palestinians is beginning to sap and isolate the will of the major powers. I mean, graphically at the United Nations, for a Security Council vote to go with only America against and the British abstaining shows a degree of international isolation, which is very, very important. I mean, I don't put enormous amounts of weight on what the UN does, but it's an illustration of the degree to which the support for the Israeli state has become isolated internationally. In this country, I don't think that the British establishment saw this coming for a minute. I think back after October the 7th, what they thought was going to happen was a rerun of the war over Ukraine. That they would project the Israeli flag onto the buildings as they projected the Ukrainian flag, that the left would be isolated, that they would have a kind of another bonanza over a proxy war. I mean, you know, the Ukrainian war was such a perfect war for Boris Johnson because no Brits had to do any fighting, so there was no bodies coming home. All they had to do was to just do the propaganda operation, and that would be perfect. And I think they thought they were going to do it again. I think they thought the Palestinians and the Israelis would do the fighting. There wouldn't be any British boots on the ground. All they had to do was run the flag up the mast, and everybody would be saluted. And they got the shock of their lives when, on that first demonstration, 150,000 people turned up. And that was a demonstration where there was only one MP, Jeremy Corbyn, who spoke. Very few trade union leaders. That was a grassroots, rank and file reaction in favour of the Palestinians. And since then, as the demonstrations have got bigger, the Liberal Party has gone from having no position to having a ceasefire position. The Tory Party has lost Suella Braverman, had to reshuffle the cabinet, and the Labour Party has been split from top to bottom over the question of Palestine. Now that's a political establishment which has just suffered some considerable damage because of the scale of the mobilisation. But there is, within this, a very real emerging threat. Suella Braverman, she lost because she wanted to ban the demonstrations, appealed to the fascist right to mobilise around the cenotaph, a direct appeal from a cabinet minister to the fascist right on the street, something we haven't seen since Enoch Powell in this country. She gambled and she failed, and she was sacked because of it. But what that has done is created a situation in which the police, I believe now, don't think they can trust the political establishment in this country. After all, look at it. Now, this is going to, I hope you're all in an imaginative mood, because I'm going to ask you to imagine yourself in the situation with Metropolitan Police. They've just had the last Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police removed, Cressida Dick, removed by Sadiq Khan. Removed because of their reaction to the Sarah Avrard killing and their policing of the demonstrations that came after that. So the last police commissioner removed essentially by their own misogyny and their reaction to people protesting about that misogyny. Now they've got a Home Secretary who tried to force them into a confrontation with the protesters, but which they weren't willing to do. And so now, if you look at, for instance, the Metropolitan Police Twitter feed, it is now entirely a kind of political commentary on protest in this country. And they are now a politicised police force running a campaign against the right to protest in this country. So we've got a huge achievement under our belt, but as we all know, this war is not over, this battle is not won, and it's not won in British politics either. So that's my account of where I think we are, but also some indication of where the tasks lie.